The marathon, a grueling, long-distance race that's been a staple of the Olympic Games for more than 100 years. It's such a classic, in fact, that it's hard to imagine the Games without it. But thanks to one particularly crazy marathon in the early 1900s, this event was almost banned from the Olympics altogether. The 1904 St. Louis Marathon featured a little bit of everything, from an insane science experiment to flagrant cheating, and a host of other, barely credible shenanigans. This is the story of the 1904 Olympic Marathon. The 1904 Olympic Games were troubled from the outset. Officially, Chicago had been selected to host the Games, but St. Louis, a few hundred miles to the south, wasn't happy with this decision. The St. Louis World's Fair was already scheduled for around the same time, and St. Louis officials were, to put it mildly, irritated to think that their grand international event might be overshadowed by something as trifling as the Olympics. So, they issued an ultimatum. Organisers would agree to move the Olympics to St. Louis, or St. Louis would schedule a rival athletic event, poach all the best athletes, and steal all the spectators. The strange thing about this "I'll hold my own party and it'll be bigger and better than yours" approach was that it worked. Chicago handed over the Olympic Games. Thus it was that the first Olympics to be held outside of Europe took place in St. Louis, bundled in with the World's Fair like a movie double bill. Because St. Louis was kind of tricky to get to, not a lot of athletes from outside the US or Canada actually showed up. Wanting to ensure a full field of runners for the marathon, organisers filled out the ranks of elite athletes with basically anyone they could find. Amateur runners who had never done a full marathon in their life were invited to join in and take a shot at gold. Needless to say, most of the runners who crossed the starting line didn't make it to the finish. The sweltering heat was enough to see some of them off, while others were incapacitated by the brutally hilly course, a route that one official called the most difficult a human being was ever asked to run over. For still others, it was the dust that did it. For most of the course, the runners were preceded by cars full of race officials, trainers, and physicians. These cars churned up so much dust as they rumbled along the bone-dry dirt roads that some runners literally almost died from breathing it in. And on top of that, there were points where the marathoners had to weave their way through traffic, dodge pedestrians, and even cross railway lines. It's fair to say that it was not a well-planned course. Of 32 competitors, only 14 actually made it to the finish line, a did-not-finish rate almost worthy of the Hunger Games. Some of those who did make it got there in some pretty interesting ways. Let's start with Fred Lortz. Lortz was technically the first to finish the marathon. Despite the baking heat and a grueling course, he crossed the finish line looking surprisingly fresh, and with an incredible time given the conditions. The crowd went wild as Lortz had his photo taken with President Roosevelt's daughter, and then stepped up to the podium to receive his medal. It was only then that several spectators started protesting loudly that Lortz was a cheat. Why did they think this? Well, as it turned out, Lortz had actually dropped out of the race before the halfway point and hitched a ride in a motor car, waving happily to spectators and other runners as he was chauffeured to the finish line. After the car broke down, he jogged the final stretch at a leisurely pace. He might have finished first, but that was because he barely ran any of the course. Lortz did his best to laugh it off. It was, he assured everyone, totally a joke. He'd been pranking them. Obviously, he wouldn't have kept the gold medal. It was all just a misunderstanding, he said. And wasn't it lovely that they could all have a good laugh about it now? Unfortunately, officials didn't buy it. Lortz was banned for life from marathon events. Except that, no, he wasn't. His ban was overturned after just a few months, and he won the Boston Marathon the next year, presumably without hopping into a taxi when he got tired this time. The actual winner of the St. Louis Marathon had altogether a rougher time of things. Thomas Hicks of the USA got gold in the end, but this was in part due to his main competitors getting knocked out of the race in increasingly unbelievable ways, a bit like an Olympic murder mystery. One fellow racer dropped out after inhaling so much dirt from the dusty road that he suffered a stomach hemorrhage. Another was chased from the course by a pack of wild dogs, and a third was delayed after stopping to snack on some apples from a nearby orchard, as you do during an Olympic event, accidentally eating some rotten fruit and suffering an upset stomach. Even with his most promising competitors out of the running, Thomas Hicks didn't have a particularly easy time of things. There were only 2 water stations along the whole of the course, and it was a sweltering day. By the second half of the race, he was suffering from advanced dehydration. You might put this lack of water stations down to poor planning, but it was actually a deliberate decision on the part of the organisers, who wanted to use the marathon as a chance to conduct an experiment into the practice of purposeful dehydration. For some reason that's more or less impossible to fathom, they thought that depriving athletes of water might actually make them perform better. And what better way to test their theory than during a marathon on one of the hottest days of the year? Accounts of Hicks's race are visceral enough to make your mouth dry just reading them. From the halfway point, he was crying out for water, water which his trainers refused to give him. Instead, they wetted his mouth with a warm sponge and fed him a dose of egg whites laced with strychnine. Yes, strychnine as in rat poison. At the time, just like the idea that dehydrating athletes might make them run faster, it was believed that a little dose of poison could act as an invigorating stimulant. As Hicks's run was reduced to a painful shuffle, they also plied him with brandy, a concentrated, extremely dehydrating alcoholic spirit. It's perhaps no surprise that, as he came within a few miles of the finish, Hicks was barely functioning. His trainers had to prop him up and push him along for step after painful step. He couldn't cross the finish line himself and instead had to be carried, his feet still shuffling rhythmically in an approximation of a run. The race officials took a look at him. Ashen skin, glazed eyes, barely breathing, hallucinating wildly, out of his mind on rat poison, begging for water, and decided, good enough. He won gold, although he probably didn't even realise it until later. One other story definitely bears mentioning, that of Felix Carvajal from Cuba, the man who stopped to snack on some rotten apples. Even before getting food poisoning, he'd had a tough time getting to the Olympics. On his way there, he'd lost all his money gambling in New Orleans, and had to resort to hitchhiking to St. Louis. When he arrived, he had no running clothes, and so competed in what he was wearing, a long-sleeved shirt and trousers. To give him some credit, he did put his trousers into sports mode by cutting off the legs with a pair of scissors. It's really no wonder that he stopped to snack on some apples during the race, given that he'd had nothing whatsoever to eat for about 40 hours prior to that. Well, no food apart from a couple of peaches he stole from a spectator on his way past. However bad they were, those apples must have looked like quite a treat. The real punchline to this, though, is that despite everything, despite losing all his money, no food for days beforehand, no running clothes or shoes, despite getting food poisoning, despite stopping for a nap to recover, Carvajal was still able to finish the race. And he came fourth. To reiterate that, he stopped for a nap midway through an Olympic marathon and still finished only one place shy of the podium. That's a feat that most professional athletes these days would definitely struggle to pull off. The fallout of all these wacky racist shenanigans was actually pretty serious. Rather than blaming the policy of intentionally dehydrating runners to the point of near collapse, officials decided that the very nature of the marathon was absurd. It was just too far for people to run. Indefensible, they called it. And it looked as though the race would be stricken from the roster of future Olympic Games. Luckily though, cooler heads prevailed. Marathons in subsequent years were planned much better, and standards have been improving ever since. The modern Olympic marathon bears no resemblance to the farce which took place in St. Louis in 1904. The courses are carefully planned. There are plenty of water stations. There are no bizarre science experiments, far fewer packs of wild dogs, and enough oversight that runners can't just hop in a car and motor their way to the finish. All of which is a good thing, of course. Although you have to admit, while it wasn't exactly safe or fair, the St. Louis Marathon must have been a fun one to watch.